Super, we're just going to go ahead and start because, as you know, the time flies by. We only have an hour and a half. So welcome to what is the Just Green Transition ? Debate seminar series. And this is the fifth and final seminar in the series. Whether or not there'll be a second season is to be confirmed, so tune in later. Most of you know me. I'm Lindsay Whitfield, Professor of Business and Development here at Copenhagen Business School. And I'm also the Director of the Just Green Transitions Observatory. Both the seminar series and the observatory are funded by the Open Society Foundation, and is co-organized by the Center for Business and Development Studies here at Copenhagen Business School and the Democracy Institute at Central European University. As most of you already know, it's a hybrid seminar series, so I want to say hi to everyone joining online this morning. The seminar structure is the same as usual. There will be a 50-minute panel debate. I have a great panel lined up for you this morning, which I'll introduce in a minute. And we're here to discuss the topic, can developmental environmentalism be democratic? I'll also explain in a minute what we mean by that. After the 50-minute panel discussion, then we'll open the floor to the audience, both physically present and online. So those of you online, don't forget to put your comments and questions in the chat box as we go and after we open the floor for comments. So let me now introduce today's panel. I'll start with Elizabeth Thurbon, who's joining us online. Elizabeth, oh, she's coming. I'll start introducing her. Well, there she is. She's Professor of International Political Economy at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. And she's the lead author of the 2023 book, Developmental Environmentalism, State Ambition and Creative Destruction in East Asia's Green Energy Transition, together with her co-authors Sung-Young Kim, Hao Tan, and John Matthews. So you can see that I've actually been very much inspired by Elizabeth's book, as the title of today's seminar takes its inspiration, because her book sought to go beyond this debate around authoritarian environmentalism and this dichotomy between political regimes, in looking at the underlying politics that drove governments in both China and South Korea, with very different political regimes, to move away from fossil fuels by supporting the commercialization of green technologies. So today's topic very much takes its inspiration from her book by saying, is it necessarily something about the political regime, authoritarian or democratic, that matters, or something else about the underlying politics? And hence the question, can developmental environmentalism, as Elizabeth lays out in her book, be democratic? And now in the room, let me introduce Donato De Carlo, Assistant Professor in Political Economy at the European Institute at London School of Economics and Political Science, and also founder of the Luis Hub for New Industrial Policy. And then sitting immediately to my right, Cornel Ban, Associate Professor at Copenhagen Business School, one of our colleagues at the Department of Organization. And both Donato and Cornel have written extensively on the topic of new industrial policy in Europe. And Cornel has also compared Europe and China in key green technologies. And I have also conducted research on Chinese and European firms in green technologies, especially the EV battery sector, including Chinese investments in Europe. So I think this is a really great panel today with a lot of expertise to debate this question. And also because I know that we don't necessarily disagree, that we don't necessarily agree. So I hope that it will be for a lively debate. So let me just give a brief introduction to the topic for those of you who aren't as knee-deep into it as the people on the panel are, to give some kind of context. Inspired by the work of the panelists, but also debates in key academic journals such as the Review of International Political Economy and New Political Economy, I would lay out the debate like this. There is growing acknowledgement among Western commentators that the green industries of the future are taking place elsewhere than the West, especially in China. And as a recent article in Ripe by Jackson and Larson opens, in December 2024, Adam Tooze declared that insofar as there is to be a global climate leader, it can now only be China. A month later, the Financial Times editorial stated that China is winning the race for green supremacy. So China's move to leader of the global green shift, as John Matthews once called it, has sparked debates about the political economy factors that explain China's ascension in green technologies. And also in parallel, there's been a growing body of literature to which both Donato and Cornel have contributed to about the rise of, or about Europe's response to China's ascendancy, which has also included a shift to industrial policy. A shift to industrial policy at the EU level with the European Commission, and its growing use by some member state governments as well as EU-level initiatives. So we have this IPE debate going on about China's rise, how do we explain that? And then we have also this literature about Europe's response, the rise of industrial policy, what are its weaknesses, what are its challenges. But as I see it, they're actually influencing each other. So a lot of times in these debates, how one sees or understands China's rise affects how they understand the weaks and strengths of Europe's response. And so I wanted, in this unique panel, drawing on both expertise in China and East Asia generally and in Europe, to bring these two together. So I think we need to understand them together. So what I'm going to do is pose two questions to the panel. The first is looking at China. Why is China leading in green technologies and now threatening European industries? And then we'll have another round where we take the question, why have European responses so far been relatively unsuccessful? I think there's some general consensus on that, especially considering both the planetary threat and the economic threat posed by falling behind in the innovation of green technologies. As I said, I think you can't jump straight to the Europe question because I think you need to look at the debates around how people understand the success with China. In our discussion, I want to push the panelists to go beyond dichotomies as it laid out in the blurb. So I would push the panelists to consider whether it is really because China is authoritarian that it's more successful than Europe with its democratic institutions, or is the situation more complex than that? Similarly, is it because China has a more effective state and state planning, and thus green economic planning, or is this too simplistic? Are China's industrial policies steered by the state and better at disciplining manufacturing firms, or is this a misrepresentation of the role between government and business? And in public debates, if you read the Financial Times or most European papers or blogs, you'll see that practitioners tend to focus on Chinese government subsidies. It's all about subsidies. China's ahead because of subsidies, right? And it's unfair competition. And this is leading to market failures and an oversupply. And these are the key words you hear over and over again. So I would also push us to go beyond that. Is there really an oversupply in EVs? What if the rest of the world were to adopt them? I think we'd have an undersupply. What is fair and unfair competition? So those are just some ideas to bring the audience with us to a debate that some of us have already been having amongst ourselves and to place some of the issues on the table. So now I'll start with question one. Why is China leading in green technologies and now threatening European industries? And as some of you are familiar with the seminar series, what we like to do is sort of have opening pitch statement and then come back for a couple of rounds of discussion where we may disagree with each other. In this first round, it will mostly be Elizabeth, Cornel, and I, but Donato, you're welcome to jump in after the pitch statements. So I'll start with Elizabeth, online.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Lindsay, for organising today, and to my fantastic panellists for joining. It's really an honour to be here with you all. This is a very interesting question. Why is China leading in the global green energy transition? And it was one of the questions that formed the part of the book, of course, Developmental Environmentalism, that my co-authors and I wrote or published in 2023. And the term developmental environmentalism forms part of that explanation. So perhaps just briefly, it would be helpful for me to explain, to set some of the terms of the debate, I guess, what we meant by the concept developmental environmentalism. And then I can say a couple of words about how it helps explain what we see going on in China. So developmental environmentalism really has three aspects. We define it as a mindset, as a legitimation strategy, and as a particular policy approach. So when it comes to the mindset, this is a shared way of thinking among policy and political leaders that is very much grounded in the traditional developmental way of thinking that has long characterized economic policy making in China and indeed in South Korea and Japan. And at its core, developmentalism is really about a particular understanding of the purpose of the economy, and that is that the economy has a political purpose, which is to build and strengthen the nation. And when it comes to thinking about the kind of economic strength, it's not just the size of the economy that matters, but strength grounded in particular capabilities. So manufacturing capacity, technological autonomy, and export competitiveness. So because the economy has this political purpose to build and strengthen the nation, that underpins a particular way of thinking about the purpose of the state, or the role of the state in the economy, the appropriate role of the state in the economy. It's understood that because the goal of economic strength is so important for national security, it is appropriate for the state. The state can and should intervene to promote these goals. And of course, can I just check that people can still hear me, because I can't. Oh, yeah, okay, excellent. That's great. And I've lost that echo. Fantastic. Thank you. Yes, so it gives way to this particular way of thinking about the role of the state in the economy. The state can and should intervene to promote the goals of manufacturing capability, technological autonomy, and export competitiveness. But around the mid 2000s, of course, these traditional ways of thinking about the purpose of the economy and the role of the state in achieving them were unsettled by the understanding that the existing economic strategy, which was a fossil fueled intensive industrialization strategy, was no longer delivering on the state's core purposes. And in particular, it was exposing the country to energy insecurity because of this excessive reliance on imported fossil fuels, and that was undermining economic competitiveness. And so thinking very strategically, the state reimagined the kind of economic growth that would be security enhancing in the long term. And so this didn't shift the kind of fundamental political purpose of the economy or the role of the state. It was really the strategy that evolved from a promotion of fossil fuel intensive export oriented industries like steel and shipbuilding and cars, and towards the new greener technology-intensive industries of the future, particularly those centred on renewable energies, as a way to boost energy security and economic security and geostrategic security simultaneously. So this was the evolution of the developmental mindset into this mindset of developmental environmentalism. And so more recently, I've kind of articulated this as policymakers thinking about the energy transition as a national security multiplier, a way to boost economic and environmental and energy and social and geostrategic security simultaneously. Okay, so that's the mindset. The second part of developmental environmentalism is that it's this legitimation strategy. So basically, the state gains its legitimacy not through procedural ways. This brings us to this question of democracy. So the state isn't pursuing legitimacy solely through procedural terms, but in terms of outcomes, delivering growth, delivering competitiveness, and delivering on the twinned goals of environmental and economic progress. And then finally, developmental environmentalism is this distinctive policy approach. And by that, we don't mean, that the specific policies like tariffs, for example, or subsidies, but it's a particular approach to sequencing the transition. In the West, we've tended to focus over, this is grounded in the idea that the energy transition is this process of creative destruction. You've got to build up the new green energy industries at the same time, so you've got to phase out fossil fuels. And in the West, the sequencing approach that we're focused on typically is kind of phasing out. We've talked a lot about carbon taxes, for example, a lot of putting costs on polluting industries and not so much emphasis on building and scaling the new industries. In China and indeed in South Korea, we've seen the opposite approach. So the government had absolutely no intention of phasing out fossil fuels until it had built and scaled its own domestic capabilities in green industries, because of course it had no interest in simply substituting fossil fuel reliance on a reliance on imports of green technologies. So we see this huge initial emphasis on building and scaling green energy industries, and only more recently are we seeing this emphasis on fossil fuel destruction. So all of this to say, developmental environmentalism that we're talking about today has these three aspects. And in the book, of course, we argue that none of those are really incompatible with democracy. China happens to be an authoritarian regime, but we purposefully contrast China with the Korean case because Korea is a developed democracy, and we see, in terms of the mindset, the legitimating strategy, and the policy approach, they're quite similar. So it's not necessarily anything to do with democracy, it's to do with state capacity. I've probably said enough as an opener. Love to pass on to my good colleagues.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Before I turn to Cornel, so I just wanted to highlight two things that you said that then we should look, and I think they will come up in the discussion, we should look at the role of ideas, the idea of the state and market, and the role of state capacity instead of political regimes per se. But now I'll give the floor to Cornel for his opening pitch.
And my mandate, according to Lindsay's careful instructions, is to create also a bit of controversy, right? So I will do that in what I'm about to say. So the first controversy is how we do social science, and I would argue that you cannot fit China into a 2x2 table required in such events. So I think there are 6 moving parts in the Chinese to understand the contradictions and the successes of Chinese decarbonization. The first is, I would agree, this is what I agree with I agree with a lot of what Lisa said, and her work inspired me greatly, particularly in opening a road to say, look, developmentalism can be democratic. So, shut the hell up about the fact that we can do this in Europe, right? Because it really is about capacity, right? So we have to re-examine that particular aspect. So I agree particularly with the point on the geopolitical motivation. But where I would put a wrinkle on what Liz said is that the geopolitical motivation was so extreme in China. It wasn't just about decarbonization. It was about energy supply. And it wasn't about cost and competitiveness, as it was about facing an American blockade on seaborne oil imports. China is sufficient on coal, which is why China scales up coal as it scales up renewables. So this particular motivation explains the content of Chinese decarbonization, which is inherently contradictory from a decarbonization perspective, but it makes a lot of sense from a clean technology production perspective. And indeed, we will see the continued reliance on coal in China for quite a while. But in comparative terms, again, this is not without precedent. Indeed, France in the 1970s scaled up gas and oil electricity production as they scaled atomic power. And then they shut down, basically they shut down fossil-based electricity production as they reached the level of state-led nuclear rollout. So China is more French than they like to admit in this regard. So not that original, and in many ways, I completely understand, and I think it's a better strategy than the one that we perhaps currently implement that generates a lot of backlash. The second is the fact that, again, like France, China is an indicative planning state, France post-war. 5-year plans enforced and enticed through a very complex integration of how you do central banking to meet, in this case, cleantech and decarbonization targets, state ownership in finance, not just in banking, but in venture capital and asset management. And those particular macro-financial institutions that we associate with Western financialization become instruments of powering through the very high costs of not just rolling out the clean technologies of yesterday. And maybe, again, a little controversy here. I think that China is betting big on innovation and new technologies by replacing the Silicon Valley venture capital, private, with state. And if you look at clean tech innovation, high quality patents, China also leads in that space. It's not just the size of rolling out solar panels, it's also where they come in with hydrogen converters, power to X, and everything else. So there is this, again, to summarize, this linkage between the planning state and the macro-financial capabilities of the state that, again, are not endogenous to, and this is where my controversy with Larson and Jackson comes in. I think I disagree with that article's core claim that that all of this is happening with China because it's authoritarian, that all these choices derive from an authoritarian imperative of suppressing consumption to have a high investment rate that would then pay for this stuff, right? So we have quite a major difference with my colleague there. The second has to do with the institutional variable, and that is something where indeed China is quite special, and I would like to hear a little bit more about Korea and Japan. But a lot of this success of, like, in terms of minimizing waste, there is a lot of wasted investment, but they minimize it over time because of the experimental governance of the Chinese state. The way in which the 5-year plans in Beijing coordinate with the 5-year plans in the provinces compete with each other in ways that might appear wasteful for us, but at the end of the day, the real question is, how are you guys feeling in your solar and wind industry in Europe as a result of our waste? You're not feeling very well, aren't you? And the same is true of cars. So this enables the Chinese to effectively troubleshoot problems and figure out what policy options don't work, and what policy problems work, and then you scale them up in the national next 5-year plan with all the firepower of the macro-financial system that's pillar 2 of this enabling structure. The fourth component here is the fact that, unlike Europe, and this is I cannot reflect on Korea, but I can reflect on Europe. What we don't have is the massive platform capital from the Chinese digital sector. Now, if you look at the genomic structure of many of the clean tech firms, as well as many of the energy firms, they are all over, they're littered with Ant Group, Huawei, Tencent, all the big, the EV industry in China cannot be understood without the role of shareholding positions of the Shenzhen miracle in digital sector. Those guys have crazy pools of capital that are privately owned, yet state guided, you could say, because they create opportunity costs for you to go in, to not go into EVs, so you go into EVs. And that amount of capital is simply not available in Europe. We have no counterpart to that. You know, SAP is something that comes pretty close, but I mean, we're talking about a country that, you know, where the market share of NVIDIA in chips went from 90% to 0%. So even after the Americans lifted the restrictions, their digital sector is so powerful, they import substituted with surely a lot of waste, we know from somebody who taught here, but at the end of the day, look, the Chinese don't need NVIDIA very much anymore, other than the chip that the Americans are not willing to give. So platform investment, pools of capital, absolutely massive. And then finally, and this is the part that's a little bit problematic, I think, which is that I am yet to be convinced that China did this by playing by the rules of the trade system. They have not, right? And I admire the Chinese system greatly, really, I do. But take batteries, right? Without the whitelist of 2016, that basically kicked out Korean producers and others from the subsidy regime and from the demand management, because we talked about subsidies, and I will criticize that as my last point. The mercantilism of clean tech growth in China is absolutely essential to understand why we kind of have to do the same with Made in Europe, with Industrial Accelerator Act and so on. So our Chinese friends have to understand that we're doing what they did to them, right? And a trade deal between Europe and China can benefit decarbonization, whereby the Chinese will understand our predicament as well. We need to have public procurement and regulations, and we need to have made in Europe regulations, just like China did the same thing, learning from the best of the developmental states, right? So in that sense, this idea that you can have mercantilism in China and open markets in Europe is inconsistent with our capacity to come up with anything close to the Chinese performance in this. So finally, your last point, the subsidies. I think we have to, this point has been made endlessly, but we still have not established how much the fiscal subsidies coming from direct transfers, yeah, from the Chinese state to EVs or solar panel companies mattered relative to the financial channel, which is something that we can do as well, because we have pools of capital in Europe, including state-owned capital, that would be big enough to do this, let alone the 13 trillion in pensions. And we need about 700 billion for decarbonization per year in Europe, right? At a capital pool of 13 trillion, it's not that much. So Rhodium Group kind of put to sleep this argument, right? Rhodium Group actually look at how much of a difference the subsidies have made for China's EV takeoff. And the price difference between BYD and Tesla in terms of the favoritism to the greatest industrial champion of the EV channel in China is 69 euros per car. That does not make a difference for buyers. What makes a difference, which is the 6,000 euro difference, is the fact that in China the suppliers wait 3 times longer than the European suppliers, and then highly paid engineers are paid half the European wages, but they're paid still very well. So it's a much more complex story, and the Commission threw in its investigations the total size of R&D subsidies in China, the total subsidies in China, which is indeed 4 times bigger than in Europe, but they have not itemized it for clean tech. So unless you do that, I'm not convinced that this is not matter. It's a certain supply chain organization in China that that doesn't have much to do with what the government in Beijing is doing. It's like endogenous to the Chinese reform period, and it has historical institutional dependencies that are very hard to replicate. So there are some things that can travel, some things that can't. And I don't think it's, to come to your main question, I think that most of this is not endogenous to the Chinese green authoritarian state. It isn't. And I don't think, I'm even uncomfortable with this term authoritarian because it's such an easy terminological anachronism, and I don't know how much of that explains. It explains some. Let's not take that away. But how much of that is the Chinese meritocratic bureaucracy and the kind of discipline within the bureaucracy and the nature of the political competition that you have to basically give higher and higher taxes to Beijing that can only come from productivity increases, including in green tech.
Good, so I think we can move away from the authoritarian point. We all agree on that. So then I'll try to move into some areas where there might be more disagreement. So I'll first comment on a few things you said and then raise a few of the issues that I want to throw on the table which haven't been said yet. And then there'll be time for one through round before we go to the next question. So I think you're very right about replacing the US Silicon Valley model today with the state. But if we remember how the Silicon Valley model was created, it was created by the state. So basically, China's just doing what the US did. And in fact, one could say that the Silicon Valley model has gone away, and we debated a few of these things in the previous seminar, has gone away from what actually drove innovation in that earlier period post-World War II. So you could say China is doing what the US did post-World War II, and that's why it's so successful. I'm going to disagree with the point that, so I think we have to think chronologically. So how did China get here? There are several steps and change over time. So platform capital may be really important now, but it wasn't in the earlier period. And so I would argue that I don't think we can say that's what got China to the supremacy in EV. It's not all the fancy software that's in the car. Of course, that's cool now, but it was batteries. Yeah. And when you talk to one of the firms that's setting up assembly, it's a Chinese EV battery company, a Chinese EV company that's setting up in Serbia to supply. They're like, oh no, we can't bring our latest model. That's way too much. Europe won't allow that. That's way too far ahead for Europe. We're going to have the dumbed down, simple model. So, I mean, what they're really, I mean, yes, it plays an important role now, but I'll go back in a second to the things that I think that really mattered. Of course, the further you get ahead, those of us who study economic development, the further you get ahead, the harder it is to catch up. But I'm not sure that the platform capital mattered so much back then. I think for the rules of the game, the WTO, you're right. But this has always been the case. I mean, the WTO was set up in a lopsided manner to begin with. It protected what Europe and the US wanted to protect and only liberalized what it wanted to liberalize. So now to say it's unfair for developing countries not to play along with the rules of the game that were rigged is a little bit, But I think, I mean, you're right. I don't think that you can become an economic hegemon with neoliberalism, but we can come back to that. On the battery whitelist, I think this is still an empirical question. It existed, and afterwards, Chinese EV battery firms outcompeted. But it only existed for 2.5 years to be for real, because the JVs with Korean firms came in. So 2015 to mid-2018. It's still, in my mind, it's still an empirical question. We cannot assume causation from correlation. There was a policy, there was an outcome. There's too much speculation going on for me in Europe and Chinese studies about what is causing what, because we're not doing industry studies and we're not doing the firm level studies to know what actually happened. It probably is the case that that very short protection period mattered, but we don't yet know. We're starting to do interviews, but we cannot say that that mattered for BYD and CATL. It probably for sure mattered for the second tier that have now caught up, like Goshen, Eve, and Suwanda. But it's just to say, and that's why I wanted to push us in this, to see what really mattered. Because if we want to say, what can Europe do, if it's not authoritarianism, right? And it's not perfect state planning from Beijing, what can you do? So I just want to throw out a few things on the table to spark some debate, specifically when we get to Europe. And this is where Cornel and I kind of ping pong in our work, but we'll bring it out. We'll bring it out into the open. But I think there is a clear change in China's industrial policy, right? So we have to think over time, because initially it very much focused on the state-owned enterprises. And trading market for technology was purely about state-owned enterprises. Private firms were not allowed to be part of this game, right, until the mid-2000s. And there we also see local governments going against what Beijing wanted. So this idea of state planning for me is just totally overdone in the literature. We would not have seen Cherry and Geely if local governments hadn't gone specifically against what Beijing's policy was. They did not have a license to produce ICE cars. We also see that Beijing's industrial policy differs by sector. So in some sectors, it's heavily interventionist, and in some sectors, it's not. So I think then this also goes against this sort of monolithic green economic planning narrative. Because in some, it's more driven, some it's more interventionist, and sometimes it's less. And I think if we look at green technologies, in solar and in EV batteries, I would argue in our research that I've done with my colleagues Tobias Wuttke and Felix May, that, and the literature I've read, that private firms drove this and government responded. And this goes against the narrative of state planning, because it was private Chinese firms that took the solar technology from Australia, and actually from the university where Liz is based, if you read Nimit's book. And there was these diaspora links between Chinese who studied there. They took that technology and they brought it back, and they scaled it. So you're right, it's not new technology, it's actually old technology. And we see the same thing in the case of BYD and CATL. They learned from Japanese, they leveraged foreign knowledge from Japan and the US, they engaged in global supply chains to produce batteries for leading European and US companies, and most importantly, now everyone should know with the book Apple in China, being part of Apple's supply chain was absolutely fundamental. And as we show in our work, it wasn't until BYD and CATL were already investing in batteries that Beijing begins to respond. And I think if you take several cases of green tech sectors, you could say that Chinese private firms changed Beijing's strategy to be more open to private firms and to put indigenous innovation on the table in a way that it didn't before. And then that brings it to last point. I think manufacturing capabilities matters. The manufacturing ecosystem, as you said, Cornel, was essential. The ecosystem in consumer electronics. We would not have seen EV batteries without consumer electronics, and the whole supply chain, the investments in minerals, all of this links back. And of course the central government helped, but actually it helped firms to scale. So it created the market. And of course nobody has China's market, right? It's huge. So once you do that, once it creates the market for you, you're ready to go. And the local government provides land and infrastructure and loans and sometimes grants. But I think to say this is state planning is to underestimate the link between imaginative entrepreneurs and an interventionist state. And I think that's important when we look at Europe. If we only think that this is about the state, then we misunderstand. And the second point is that manufacturing and innovation are linked. And I think economists have gotten this wrong for a long time. They thought you could connect the two and still be the leader of be at the technological frontier. I think what the China story shows us is that you cannot delink them. There was a time lag in that. That to do radical innovation, you still need manufacturing, right? Manufacturing ecosystem, the whole supply chain. And they were not the result of some grand plan by the CCP. We have to let that go. Because if Europe tries to do that under the idea that that was what happened, that's wrong. Because it built up slowly, idiosyncratically, by a response, firm investment, government response, government response, right? Over 20 to 30 years. So central planning is not going to be the answer. I think what we rather need to look at is what makes firms invest, and he knows I'm going to say this, and how they develop innovative capabilities, not some planning state. And that this might help us better see then what are the challenges and weaknesses in Europe.
Why do we set up this false dichotomy between the planning state and the entrepreneurial ebullience? One of the things, when you go to China interviews, they scold you for this. They say, why do you think that the two are this kind of Götterdämmerung confrontation between opposing historical forces? You know, this is a productive incoherence in the Chinese mindset, and they think it's very Western to see the two as contradictory. And they say it's also contradictory with what you guys have done in the post-war period, when you were embedding entrepreneurial ebullience into not central planning, but it's a very important, it's not just an anal terminological term, but an indicative form of planning, experimentalist, messy, dirty, dysfunctional at times. And I personally, as you know, I take a sort of state-led co-constitutive relationship, right? I think the state does lead in this. There were technologies when the Made in China 25 came that did not exist in China. That was a Prometheic thing from the top. But at the same time, if you look in the value chain, that would make the mass manufacturing of those innovations possible. The capabilities are there as well. So you need to have both. But the state was in the driving seat in many of the clean tech technologies. We have more time to disagree on the details, but the key thing here, I buy Yingyao Wang's explanation of the markets with bureaucratic characteristics account, where she says it wasn't the central planners that are responsible for this particular form of indicative planning. It was the Ministry of Innovation and Technology, MIT, and then this kind of elite group of planners that the Central Bank of China created in the late 2000s. And it is on the back of this kind of, the French would call them the les énarques. I mean, it was a new elite that was different from the old planning elite. There is an evolution, you're right, inside the Chinese state. Yes, they were always developmentalists, but the way they did developmentalism completely changed as a result of the institutional struggles inside the state between MIT, PBOC versus the NDRC, which is the kind of conventional planning agency. And I think that combined with, and I thank you for raising the issue in the last few years, for me, of the role of state, of firm capacity. There is that interaction. But for me, it was the state in cleantech, for me, it was the state in the driving seat. And of course, it's a hybrid process, but in this particular sector, not so much in electronics, where I would think that it was mostly private Schumpeterian processes there, but in cleantech, I don't think that was the first vector. So I think the question here is, and that's the part I don't know, and I would like future researchers to do, to show how much this kind of private push against the state to change planning kind of found a counterpart in this inter-elite, inter-agency struggle that the Chinese ministries and agencies had in the 2000s that led to the current equilibrium that's pretty much, still evolving, right? I mean, people are in and out of favor with Beijing, they go to Japan, they come back, you know what I'm talking about. So we don't have a good terminology to describe this co-constitutive clunky term, right? To describe what's going on here, because if you just use developmental state, dirigisme, etc., they're very limited terms. I think we're not terminologically creative enough.
And I think I want to bring Liz in on this point, but I think that's what I'm trying to say. It's co-constitutive, but people are not looking at the pushback, and they're not looking at the role. And the same time that you have the evolution of thinkers in the ministries of innovation, including someone coming who worked in the automobile industry in Germany, you also have the rise of these companies. And you have Wang Chongfu and Robin Xing, who have this long history of producing in consumer electronics. And you cannot have EV batteries without consumer electronics, so I don't know why you're differentiating between them and green tech. But it's this kind of push, it's this interface, and that's not being studied. And I think that's what Liz's work in South Korea showed so well, when people also called South Korea a developmental state without looking at how the industrial policies were not driven by the state and implemented top-down, but actually co-constitutive between personal relations between the chairman of these chaebol and Park Chung-hee and then later elites. But Liz, do you want to come in before we move to question 2?
Oh, just very briefly, and I would say I'm sorry, I'm just getting that echo again. So sorry if perfect, that's great. Wonderful, thank you. That's great. Yes, look, I would absolutely agree about this false dichotomy between, is it state-led, is it business-led? We can go back to the very early work here of Linda Weiss on governed interdependence, I think, between government and business, that was really central to the whole developmental project in Japan and Korea and Taiwan, and in which, the government and business work collaboratively towards mutually beneficial outcomes, which is economic growth, but within terms set by the state and with a significant degree of discipline involved for those firms that wish to receive state supports of various kinds. So I would, only wholeheartedly agree that it's in the developmental state literature as foundationally elaborated, it was never just about the state. The government-business relationship is what is characteristic of developmentalism. And governed interdependence, I think, is a really beautiful characterization of that. And, in Linda's work, she looks at that in the US. So it's certainly, I would agree again with Lindsay, this is not a distinctively East Asian imagining. It is very much apparent in the incredible techno-industrial transformation of the US and its emergence as the high-tech hegemon at the end of World War II.
Thanks. Donato, you want to come in? I just wanted to plug. I think for some reason, Linda Weiss's work on governed interdependence is under-recognized in European and US academic. And I don't know why. Maybe there's too much pond in between Australia and Europe and the US. But it's true, we do have a term. Cornel, go ahead.
Right. No, I mean, my mandate here is to speak more about Europe. But there is one aspect that I find interesting about this discussion when it comes to the question as to whether authoritarian rule plays a role. And here I agree very, very much that this is not kind of the main aspect, what is the main driver. But there is one thing I want to say that becomes especially interesting when comparing China with Europe, is that to some extent authoritarian rule here supports interventionism in a very, very specific way, because first of all, it prevents ideational pluralism, right? It, in a competitive multi-party system, you can have rival visions of the state-market relations emerge, and especially, with alternation in power, you can have policy incoherence and policy discontinuity and reversals. So also it works to give a medium-term clear direction to where the market is going. That also spills over to the subnational, which in China is kind of the provincial governmental level. You send a clear signal of where you want the economy to go in the next five years, right? Why am I mentioning this? Because, I mean, when we compare this to Europe, this sort of ideational aspect, what Liz rightly calls the developmental mindset, for structural reasons, it's very difficult to have a coherent developmental mindset for the very way in which Europe is structured, right? At the supranational level, you have very, very strongly competing idea of what is the role of the state in the economy and what the state market nexus should look like. Think, for example, about DG competition. That is, now I think it's changing very much, DG competition, but for a long time in the literature, it has been described as the ordoliberal citadel, right? Competing with DG Grow, that is a very much more kind of French interventionist idea. Compare this to with DG Connect, it's kind of more Schumpeterian in its approach. At the national level, like the member state level, what I call the subnational, meaning the EU as a federation, well, you have a major problem that the EU doesn't work like China, in the sense that in China you have one supranational, like one federal principle, and many agents that execute coherently, right? A mindset that is kind of conveyed through planning. The EU works the other way around. You have a federal agent with 27 principles who disagree, who have very different growth models. Germany, Eastern Europe, Italy, France, they have very different material interests, very different electoral incentives at different points in time, and especially, Europe is has been built as a battle of ideas between kind of French interventionism and German ordoliberalism. I mean, we will talk about this more in question 2, but
Let's just go ahead and move into question 2. So you can keep going.
Yeah, right. So just to say,
but I just want to push you. I mean, is it authoritarianism or is it ideas about the role of the state?
My point would simply be that in the way China is structured, it is much more likely to have a more coherent developmental mindset that is not challenged by democratic pluralism and then can be vehicled across the layers of the state and in the relationship between state and market. Give coherent medium-term directionality. In Europe, here we disagree every 2 years about what we want to do. Now we have the ETS, now we want to roll it back. We have a regulatory state, now we want to do the regulation and simplification. We want to have state aid, but now we want to liberalize state aid and so on, right? So there is much more scope for challenge that create a different type of inconsistency and incoherences that may not always be productive if your goal is give directionality to the market and have the state mandarins and the market actors operate along that direction.
But I mean, the reason I was just pushing you is to think, because and Liz can comment, she may know better than I do, but it's not just the political elite. It's a general idea. So it's an idea held by economists, it's an idea held by firms, and it's an idea, as far as I've seen from the surveys, held by the general populations in China, Japan, and Korea, that is the appropriate role of the state. So that's why I'm pushing us to see, is this because of some authoritarian political idea that's being pushed from the top, or it's because people in Asia think about the role of the state and the economy differently because they have fundamentally developed more recently and remember that the state actually played a role, as opposed to in Europe and the US where the state played that role, but it's been so long that they have forgotten that the state played that role. So the reason that Europe keeps flip-flopping is because firms can't decide if they want the state or don't want the state. And economists have been educated for 30 plus years that the role of the state is bad. And I mean, you know, I'm just pushing you a little bit to.
There are many people, many firms, many countries that think that the appropriate role of the state is much more interventionist in Europe, right? It's just that there is a struggle of ideas, and it's difficult to articulate this coherently at the European level. Let alone, you know, recently there was this paper in Ripe that showed that even at the German level, which for a long time, you know, you knew what the German interest was, it's export-led growth, right? Now this paper shows that it's difficult even for the German government to articulate what its unique interest is, because different industrial clusters at the national level have different material interests now, driven by different levels and types of vulnerabilities in global value chains, right? So what I'm trying to say, it's very difficult to articulate a coherent idea of the role of the state. It's not that we don't have people that think that we should be more French, so to speak, right, in Europe.
And I think Cornel wanted to come in, but it's just to say, I mean, that's also, you can find, and again, Liz has worked a lot on Taiwan, but you can find, if you look at Taiwan in the 70s, there were also fierce debates about whether the state should play a role in semiconductors at all. But that is the political process. You have to have an open discussion and come to some level of consensus, or to have some elite that wields enough political support within the coalition at a certain time to push through a consensus, right?
But,
Just
Oh, go ahead, Liz.
sorry to jump in there. Look, I mean, I take your point that, you know, there's certainly a lack of consensus about the appropriate role of the state in Europe and indeed in my own country, Australia. I mean, we're having exactly the same debates as are playing out across Europe at the moment. And I think some really interesting discussion to be had about the very similar challenges we're facing and, you know, what we can learn from each other's experiences. But I think that when it comes to popular support for the transition, it's less to do with this abstract idea about whether the state should or shouldn't play a role. I think Donato's point, you know, about the question really for the public is, should we be doing the green transition, right? Rather than what role should the state play for. So this is the fracturing of the consensus. It's for the very idea of the fact that, you know, should the government be trying to speed up the transition, and largely that comes down to two things. One is this kind of ideological debate about climate change and whether it exists, because in the West, when we've argued to speed up the transition, we've focused overwhelmingly on the question of climate change. We've talked about the moral imperative, whereas in China, they've articulated it as a economic and energy security opportunity, basically. You know, this is the key to national energy independence. This is the key to future economic competitiveness. This is why we should be doing it. You know, climate change is, to the extent that environmental questions came into play, and they do, but they're more about particulate pollution, right? Which is a huge political legitimacy challenge in China and indeed across Asia. So it fractures in the West in terms of belief in climate change and the subjection to the moral, but it also fractures because of the cost, right? Because we have in the West really failed to grapple with this question of the reality, which is that it's very capital intensive. The energy transition is really capital intensive. And at the outset, green energy has tended, I mean, it's different now, renewables is now, in many instances, thanks to China's investment, the cheapest form of energy. But while we do the building out of the grid, while we do the building out of the at-scale wind, solar, hydrogen, etc., this has had an impact on energy prices. And so that is the fracturing. So I think, if we want to, before we even get to the question of within the state resistance to the idea, it has to be about how do we build a social and political consensus for the transition. And that has to do, I think, with the stories that we tell about why the transition is important. And it's not just for the climate. It's also for the economy. It's also, and in today's world, this is about manufacturing energy independence and energy security. That's a much more powerful narrative, I think, for many than the climate imperative, which is I believe it is the moral imperative. I believe it's the existential challenge, but 50% of people don't agree.
I completely agree with that, and I think as much as I hate canceling my vacation, I think the Hormuz crisis is a fantastic accelerator of Europe's political motivation to realize its energy vulnerability as a fossil fuel poor continent. We're actually much more vulnerable than China is to such events, and Donato is about to give you the full Rube Goldberg governance of the European political system. But if there's one chance of reducing the number of parts in the Rube Goldberg, is having an existential insecurity throughout European polities that will frame and sell in a partisanship way, decarbonization as a security imperative. So I want a second J.D. Vance administration and 2 more straits closed to oil, and then we will do it. I think the Rube Goldberg will become very simple. It will become complete. Yeah, exactly. It will become as much as quality of life and vacations kind of consensus in Europe. We want to bring it at that level, and because of what Donato is about to tell you. As long as our transatlantic relationship is ambiguous enough for us to be entrapped into the American petrostate market and security protections, this level of insecurity will not exist in Europe, because it is not in America's interest for us to buy less LNG from them, and therefore they will not make us feel as insecure as they made the Chinese feel insecure, and then remove the veto points in the Chinese state. Let's remind everyone, 2009, China crashed the Copenhagen Climate Summit. It was a carbon titan. This is how everybody saw China at the time. There was a real debate inside the CPC at the time about climate. A lot of comrades thought this is a waste. We can't afford it. We're a latecomer, industrializer. This is capital intensive. We should focus on the low-hanging fruit of growth, not on these technologies that we don't know what they do. So the Malacca trilemma about the Pentagon rehearsing a blockade in exercises is what enabled the green push people overrule the veto points in the system and enabled the green capitalists and electronics and all this coalition that you, Lindsay, are talking about. So of course there was a lot of contestation in China as well. I mean, this is not some kind of seamless Soviet Union 1936. This is far from that, right? And I think we should just stop making these easy Cold War comparisons, because otherwise we miss our understanding what China is about. So yes, I want a bit more transatlantic struggle. I want more extreme American petrostate pushes and more conflict in Suez, Malacca, and Hormuz. And we'll miss a few vacations. We'll be a little bit poor, but we'll do it in the end.
We'll be forging Friday.
Yes. Donato, barring more of that, can you give us your take on the challenges that Europe faces in catching up in green technologies?
Right. So, I mean, I come to these questions as a political economist that studies industrial policy and multi-level governance. And I mean, my feeling is, I mean, I cannot testify to the micro level, as you rightly put it, and I also like your paper a lot on BYD and cattle. So, I mean, to put it very, very bluntly, I think that what we are doing now in Europe is interventionism in an ordoliberal economic structure. That is, one we could think about it with the term of economic constitution that is very prominent in constitutional political economy, but also among legal scholars, right? And I mean, we have a very peculiar economic constitution in Europe, which is the result of many decades of European economic and monetary integration. But the bottom line is that Europe was not built to do industrial policy, right? Europe was built to dismantle industrial policy, right? Whatever the goals, as Liz rightly put it, what should we do with state interventionism, right? Economic security and so on, whatever the goals, right? Europe is not built to do industrial policy. And this is very, very evident. First of all, in the constitutionalization of competition law, which, it's a very interesting comparison to what happens in China, right? Structures the economy in a very, very different way in China, and I agree much of the music is playing at the provincial level, but there, for sure, it's market-based competition, cutthroat competition, but it's also a very interesting dynamic of political competition, right, among provincial governments, right, who have fiscal incentive to engage in subsidy raise because, they're a big share, half of their local tax revenues depend on output growth, essentially, and also they have very clear political incentives, right, to move up in the party ladder, right. So it's a very specific form of political competition at the kind of what I call subnational level to mean the provincial government. In Europe, this form of political competition is de jure outlawed by the treaties, right? Because differently, through cooperative integration, we have agreed to put competition law at the supranational level, and that's what exactly it's ruled out in Europe for the sake of, what we call now fears of fragmentation or tilting the level playing field. In China, at the provincial level, tilting the level playing field is exactly the main feature of the system. In Europe, the Letta report was all about, we should be careful about not bending protecting the level playing field. This form of political competition among the member states in Europe is ruled out, right? You cannot engage in subsidy race, right? And to the extent that state aid is allowed, state aid being the European term for subsidies, to the extent that it is allowed, it's based on a very different logic, right? It's ex ante considered illegal, like to be prohibited. It can only be granted only to the extent that it addresses a very specific market failure or pursues a common European project, but you need to notify this to the Commission, you need to show it in advance, and that you need to get approval, right? So this is a very different economic structure that is, in fact, over the years, since the 80s, when the Commission really started to strictly enforce competition law, has led to essentially the decline of national state subsidies and the convergence toward what the Commission thinks is good state aid, right? So this is to say that a system like decentralized subsidy raise, as has partially driven the Chinese dynamic, is impossible in Europe. But also more fundamentally at the level, and Cornel has done a lot of work on this, on the microfinancial alignment, right? We cannot get our house in order in Europe simply because, we cannot do monetary policy in that same way. We cannot do credit policy, right? Market neutrality of the ECB, political independence of the ECB. Fiscal policy, can we pull in the right direction with all the strings? Well, at EU level, we do not have a substantive, genuine fiscal capacity for industrial policy. We have tried hard over the last 6 years to create the name has changed, European Competitiveness Fund, European Sovereignty Fund. We wrote what I think is a nice article with Manuela Moschella and Lorenzo Moretti, where we show, that all these attempts at pooling essentially fiscal capacity for industrial policy purposes at the supranational level, they hit the veto point in the council, right? Because to do everything that matters fiscally, we have unanimity requirements in the council, right? So that's a big obstacle to, supranational centralized fiscal capacity. Another incoherence, national fiscal capacity. On the one hand, DG Comp, the Commission has been saying over the last 5-10 years, we should flexibilize state aid regulations, bend the constitution of the regulatory state, because we don't have fiscal capacity at the supranational level. We should now, after 30 years of imposing regulation to constrain state activism, we should now give room to member states to use their national budgetary resources to do state aid and pull in the direction of our common European strategic objectives. So on the one hand, the Commission has been flexibilizing the state aid regime through various frameworks, right? The temporary state aid framework and the latest in order, the CSAF, right? To say, okay, this is a medium-term flexibility until 2030. Now, not only you can do it, I want you to do it, but you can, me, the Commission, I don't have the tools at the supranational level. What I do is I use regulation for interventionist purposes. I set the guardrails, give you directionalities, you member states spend, right? Well, but on the other hand, we have reintroduced the Stability and Growth Pact in 2024 that is saying, well, yeah, in theory you can spend, now you have regulatory flexibilities to spend, but now we have fiscal constraints to the extent you can spend, right? And this creates fragmentation where only larger and better endowed countries like Germany can have more fiscal resources, right? These are just concrete examples to drive home a key point, that is the European economic constitution is much, much more complex and institutionalized than the Chinese way. And this highly constrains and leads to this macro-financial misalignment. And just last point, now with Cornel, we were discussing this over the weekend, and we came to the conclusion that we are living through a sort of European purgatorium, so to speak. Politically,
we are Catholics, we couldn't help it.
And by this I mean to say something very specific, that in a way we are trapped in a bad politico-institutional equilibrium in Europe at the moment, right? Because we, over the decades of European integration, we have removed the national level policy capabilities to do industrial policy, but also macroeconomic stabilization, right? Just governing the market, as we say in political economy, from the national level, but we have not yet fully reproduced them at the EU level. But politically now, we cannot move forward fully due to unanimity requirements on all those things that are most sensitive to do geoeconomics, essentially, and touch on nation-state core powers. But also at the same time, we cannot go back, right? And the result is a sort of we have moved for sure beyond the regulatory state. Now we are more creative through bricolage, new instruments, a plethora of geoeconomic instruments, brokering, industrial alliances, state aid flexibilization, but we are very far away from, creating a full-fledged developmental state.
I have lots of questions, but I realize we're running out of time, so I want to open the floor first to those in-house and also online to ask a couple of questions and comments. And we'll take all of them, and then we'll go back for 1 or 2 minute sum up. So Dominic, Stefano has a question, and also in the back. Remember to say your name so the people online know who's speaking.
It's on. I'm Stefano Ponte, professor here at CBS. I would really like to buy in your dream of pain and then gain, Cornel, where we have another two J.D. Vance governments led in the U.S., and then Europe gets its act together. We reframe decarbonization away from environmentalism and into an energy security slash more sort of strategic defensive realm, and then move on to that. So the big question that we haven't asked is, will the US let us do that? I mean, if they plug on to digital infrastructure, they plug off the plug, we can't do anything. Secondly, we are signing up now these 20, 30-year contracts for very expensive LPG and oil that is coming from them. So how can then we envision that, number one? Number two, on the more political level, yeah, I mean, so far anything that J.D. Vance has touched has gone wrong. Okay, Hungary turned around. Let's see what happens though in Germany, France, and outside of the EU, the UK in the next few years. Would they let that happen again?
Hi everyone, thanks for the lovely discussion. It's been really informative. I'm Lasse, by the way. So I have a question primarily about this ideological coherence you mentioned that that China have that I would like to challenge or engage a bit further with, because you mentioned, like, rightly so, there is some discussion about ideas in the EU, but it is, no matter what kind of political party, it's mainly through a lens of neoliberalism. Even if you're a social democrat or a socialist party, you primarily legitimize yourself through a lens of neoliberalism. And I get that there is maybe like a stronger ideological coherence in China, but there is, on the policy level, there seems to be so much conflict and diverging interests that there actually, within that is there's like more pluralism in the actual implementation of policy, especially as it goes through the various levels, from like top level Politburo to the local mayor.
Okay, thank you. I'm Fanny Ersgaard Madsen from Roskilde University. And so this is super interesting because I just started on a research project on this in the Saudi Arabian context. And I just wanted to ask you to reflect on, it seems like you argue, perhaps not that much you, but then a common argument is that it's not the authoritarian structure that defines this this transition, the green sort of investments. But then couldn't you, if you turn it around and say, then what does this environmental aspect do to the authoritarian structure? I mean, in the Saudi context, how I perceive it, I just started, but it seems like this authoritarian agenda really plays an important role in supporting the authoritarian structure. So it might not be that it's the authoritarian political system that does this per se, but then on the other hand, it does relate in a way that I want you to perhaps consider. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. This was a really fantastic panel and super insightful. I wanted to ask Donato about your last point on the sort of the European purgatory state. And I'm wondering, what do you feel are the what do you feel are the main political internal obstacles to moving Europe from our current fragmented, incomplete institutionalization towards a more fully fledged developmental state? What's keeping us from making the political moves and reforms to get us there? You'd think Europe is feeling existential pressure now, and there's a window of opportunity maybe to making some ambitious moves. I'm just wondering what are the obstacles that we're not discussing?
There are no more immediate questions in the audience and none online at the moment, so maybe if we take a quick response, then if there's any other. I also had a question point I wanted to raise, but I first want to give the floor to Donato. Do you want to respond first? And
Right. Thanks for the questions. I mean, let me pick on the ideological coherence and the point, that we are still, if I understood correctly, we're still stuck in a kind of neoliberal superstructure, so to say. I am not entirely sure. To be honest, I think, if you ask the French, they were never really 100% into it, and you can see kind of an interesting battle of ideas in the Industrial Accelerator Act, right? That The French criticize it for not being protectionist enough, and the Nordics criticize it for being too protectionist, right? So I do think that there is a real and genuine battle of ideas. Not everything is neoliberalism, although where I would agree is that we do have an ordoliberal economic constitution in Europe, which has entrenched in the way it works, kind of, a neoliberal way of doing things in Europe in different dimensions, from fiscal policy, fiscal stability, monetary stability, consumers' welfare and market failure over political direction to the economy via subsidies, right? But I think there is a very, very genuine discussion going on. Second point on what is keeping Europe back. To be honest, I think we are not, this is the key point, the key question to ask, and I think in the debate it's a little bit lost. What is the kind of the main original sin, so to speak, of what in my view is happening here is still, intergovernmentalism in core state powers that now touch on above all fiscal and defense increasingly. And the problem is even also there, it's a constitutional problem. It's constitutional and institutional unanimity in the council, right? We will not go back because no political party at the national level has an incentive to go back to kind of the nation state, like the Streichian dream of the nation state, right? But we can also not move forward, right? So I think there are only two ways out. I don't have very satisfying answers, but the two ways out would be a grand bargain. We sit somewhere in a castle and we don't get out until we sort this out. And the other, with Cornel, we're also calling it institutional plumbing in a way, right? Trying to, refine the structure at the margin. For one, the simplest thing that can be done to try to realign state aid flexibilities with fiscal constraints, right? Trying to say, okay, now we want you to give subsidies, all the subsidies that are approved by the Commission. To give a concrete example of one reform that could be done politically, right? Through CSAF, the latest temporary framework in the context of the Clean Industrial Deal, you could say, and that's politically and legally feasible, you could say all the state aid that is approved by DG Comp has been, legally conforms to the treaties because it has been approved by DG Comp, then this needs to be taken out from the calculations of net expenditures in the Stability and Growth Pact, for the Stability and Growth Pact, right? That's a concrete example to say we need to get our macroeconomic mix right, and this can be done if we look at where the inconsistencies are.
So just to throw something totally different out there, and just want to hear if you agree or disagree. I don't disagree that governance is a problem, but two things. I think there's something else totally not being talked about. And then two, it reminds me of work on the Global South. It's like, if we can just fix everything, then we can get development. But that's never going to happen. So you could also flip it around, like we often do in discussions about economic development in the Global South, and say, actually, we need to work on micro successes, because micro successes can build up and they can underpin grand bargains. But the point I want to throw out is, one thing that's never talked about is the fundamental effect of outsourcing on Europe's manufacturing ecosystem. To me, the problem is that. And I'm not saying it has to be and or, but I would at least like that to be out on the table, because from the 1980s, not only do you do that, but you start outsourcing. And stuff that used to be produced is completely outsourced to Asia. After 30 years of doing that, you cannot just overnight build entire supply chains. And I'm not saying that Europe doesn't produce things still, but I think missing the consumer electronics ecosystem, which the US did as well, and is why it fell behind in semiconductors, and also why Apple had in the end how to outsource everything, because they just didn't have really good manufacturing capabilities. It's the loss of that. This kind of mass manufacturing, precision manufacturing, and then equally responsible for that is financialization. So today it's hard to shift back. So I think even if you manage to change European governance, if you don't change the financial system or come up with some kind of parallel system, I mean, this is Will Lazanik's point, and I said it a lot, but I don't think people were listening when he was saying it all the time. Like, without retain and reinvest, we're not getting anywhere. So if you look at what's happened in the EV battery sector, the EU has given money, and the firms are failing. It's not just about fiscal prowess. It's also about what are the fundamental challenges within Europe about building capabilities. And without the two being discussed together, I think we're missing a big part of that. So neoliberalism matters maybe not in ideas, but in the way that the financial system works. And it's a huge problem because when these companies came into trouble, they were not saved, right? And they also sold themselves and their ability to do what Asia did. They thought it was so easy. They totally misunderstood the capabilities that Asian factories actually have, right? It wasn't modular. It wasn't buy a bunch of machines and put it together. It was a tacit knowledge in precision manufacturing. So I just want to throw that out. And Cornel and Liz?
So building on that, I think this implicit knowledge loss is important, but we also have to be very careful to see quantitatively how much of that outsourcing has gone to Asia and how much has gone to Eastern Europe. Because if you actually look at European production chains in automotive, they're almost entirely in Eastern Europe. There's very little loss to Asia in that regard. So the knowledge loss was to the Czech Republic and Poland, who are now, engineering juggernauts, but they are dependent economies on the West European economies at the same time. So that's a kind of consistent relationship within the European core. Now, in electronics, this is true, so you have to go sector by sector. Batteries, of course, critical minerals, gone, right? But then when it comes to the core export of Europe, which is precision engineering, that has remained in Europe for the most part. And there is very good modeling done by somebody from the Singaporean Port Authority. It's like a very weird institution that does really good modeling of production networks, and they find that the European precision engineering has largely stayed in Europe. We do not depend on China very much for that particular thing. And it was mostly, EU enlargement plus just in time, because the distance and the abundance of skills in Eastern Europe and the low wages did not make China necessary in that relationship. But let me build theoretically on what you said. There is an implicit knowledge argument to be made in the private sector, but there's one to be made in the public sector. How many of our European governments would be capable to execute industrial policy mandates on par with the Chinese provincial bureaucracy? Mm-hmm. Good luck with that. I mean, you're looking at a sort of Bayesian updating mechanism inside that bureaucracy. This is what they're trained to do, right? Their incentive structure. I mean, if those guys had the typical day of a Danish Ministry of Economy bureaucrat that is new public management reporting timesheets, right? And kind of complete time waste on, as opposed to what they're supposed to do, they would not be the kind of planning juggernaut that they are. So there is a conversation like, even if we didn't have the Rube Goldberg, the evisceration of implicit knowledge in the industrial policy bureaucracy is so extreme that in France, when they try to get the planning between the Ministry of Defense and the privately owned defense firms in France, there were the people that knew how to do it retired, and there was nobody to replace them. Indeed, there is a lot of sociological work from Lemoine and company showing that even in the best of cases in Europe, that bureaucracy is missing, right? Their skill set doesn't lend itself to a developmental state approach, even if we had the consensus at the European level. Mm-hmm. And that leads me, so there's implicit argument, implicit knowledge lost in the state too. This leads me to Stefano's question, right? I mean, when I proposed my extreme hypothesis, it's provocative, but it's an economist fallacy, right? It kind of oversimplifies the world for a second. I mean, you're completely right. I mean, there's a Rube Goldberg in governance, but there's one in the transatlantic relationship, right? So even if you sort out Donato's problems, you're left with the dependence on America on defense, digital, and oil and gas, right? And they have no interest of letting that go. And they are effectively present in each government in Europe through NATO and everything else. So you would have to have a transatlantic agreement to be allowed to operationalize something like that in a way that responds to a critical faction of American capital, right? I mean, if you take a materialist position on this, you cannot do this in a confrontation with the US. You're going to lose that war. Yeah, I mean, that's gone. So that Rube Goldberg matters, I think, more than our constitutional Rube Goldberg entanglement. I like the question about what does this do to the authoritarian state. I think that's a fantastic question. And what it does, I think we have to take a two-stage view. In the short term, it weakens the economic legitimacy of the Chinese state because they have to allocate resources from consumption to investment. This is true. But at the same time, it is not true that consumption growth is so low in China. In fact, it's much faster than in all of the other Asian states, if you take the point of departure in 2000. But in the long term, I mean, we have to remember, China is not South Korea. China is a Hegelian state, right? The end of history constitutionally for China is socialism. You cannot have socialism like in Mao's philosophy, which is to have socialism in a technologically backward country. You have to be the technologically dominant country in the world to protect yourself against imperialist attack. I mean, this is, I'm talking from within the Marxist-Leninist framework. And once you understand that, then in the long term, the short-term pain, which is technological dominance at the expense of easy economic legitimacy to consumption, would then lead the CPC in also delivering on even more consumption in China, because at that point they don't have a rival. So this is not like some conventional East Asian story of upgrading within value chain and even leapfrogging. This is about complete dominance. This is about great power. This is great power stuff. I mean, South Korea was not great power. Japan is a dependency of the US in security terms. This is a regime that feels threatened. And the way that they protect themselves is through trade and technology. They're not interested in some kind of territorial expansion and some attack on the West and things like that. I think we have to. So yeah, two states. Short term, it's weakened. You have double-digit unemployment for young people in China. You have malinvestment going on, underinvestment in public goods. There is no welfare state. There's low pensions, etc., etc. But then, if you have technological dominance, you can sort out that problem pretty easily, right? You don't have the external constraint. And I'm going to stop because then I'm abusing.
Yeah, I want to bring Liz in for the last 2 minutes. I'm sure she has a lot to say on this, but just, I don't think, the Communist Party may have that, but I think the end of history is yet to be written. And I think it will play out in different dynamics, even if it is much bigger than Korea. The impulses are still there. And I think what makes China different than Saudi Arabia is exactly the manufacturing capabilities, is exactly the large local private firms who have their own agenda, and sometimes this erupts, like with Jack Ma and others. I mean, and you see, of course, the state wins, but then the state loses, and I think that is a tension, and we don't know how that will play out in the end. But that, I mean, but that I think is the difference with Saudi Arabia, that you have someone pushing back against the state, that you have a huge capitalist class, and the state doesn't just get its way. Liz, last word to you.
Thank you. Look, I mean, I have to say I agree with so much of what I've heard in the last suite of comments, but particularly Cornel's point, I think, is absolutely imperative. And this is, once we get through all these ideological debates about whether the state can and should intervene, this question of state capacity, and, we're kind of ending the seminar where we started on this question of capacity, and what does that look like in a country or countries in Europe, in my own country, Australia, where decades of neoliberal reform have hollowed out the capacity of the state to engage in anything approximating strategic activism. And there's a huge risk here in terms of when you have states that lack that capacity, that suddenly become very ambitious and decide that they will experiment. And if they fail, big, it tends to undermine the legitimacy of intervention itself. And so you have this kind of blowback. and you kind of can't build the capacity because you need to experiment, and when you experiment you start to fail, and then people start to lose confidence. So this is an incredibly tricky question, and we won't solve it by trying to look to China and do the kind of energy statecraft, green energy statecraft, or developmental environmentalism that China is doing. Because again, as Cornel points out, it's of an ambition, a level of ambition and a level of fiscal capacity that is far beyond anything that we can contemplate in our respective countries. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do anything, but it means that we need to be very smart about how we design our interventions in ways that are fiscally responsible, adaptable, sensitive to learning, highly disciplined. The project I've been leading for the past couple of years, the Green Energy Statecraft project here in Australia, have really been turning our mind to this question of how do you, in a country of the level of fiscal constraint of Australia, how do you design techno-industrial policies that can catalyse these massive first-of-a-kind green iron projects, sustainable aviation fuel, in ways that deal with the green premium, in ways that maintain legitimacy for intervention. And I believe that there are ways to do this. In Australia, we're talking about a clean commodities trading initiative. We're talking about ways that we can synchronise with other middle powers across the region in terms of the introduction of mandates, levies, all sorts of interesting innovations that aren't trying to mimic China, because that is that's not going to happen. And I also thought that the question around authoritarianism and the role that it might play in this developmental environmentalism in China is really interesting. That maybe it's not that authoritarianism explains the outcome, but maybe the outcome of intervention is to successful intervention is to reinforce the legitimacy of this particular regime, and it lends itself to this self-reinforcing cycle. I think that's a really interesting point. Probably just to finish, I would say that the other question about ideological coherence is a really important one. And I think the way that ideology intervenes in the Chinese and European and Australian cases is really different. In Europe and in Australia, we do have this ideological approach to the role of the government in terms of this strong commitment to neoliberal ideas and the market as a solution to most problems. But that's a really different way. It's a really different role of ideology in China. We often think of the Communist Party and therefore, must imagine that the state has to be at the centre. But as we've heard from Lindsay and from everyone, that is not the case. Actually, the ideological commitment, if you want to put it like this, in China is to the outcome. It's a goal orientation. It's not a commitment to a means, it's a commitment to an end. And so this explains this strong desire to, and strong willingness to go, sometimes the state will take the lead. Other times the market will work better. It's a pragmatism. It's a pragmatism, not an ideological commitment to the mode of governance, but rather it's a commitment to the outcome.
So not only are we out of time, we're over time, but I want to thank the panelists for coming today, and all of you in the room, in the audience, and online for the audience for participating today. Thank you so much. And can you just put up the last slide? So. So just to say that all the videos of the seminar series will be available. They are already available on the Central European University website. This is the link for all of you that have signed up for online participation. You will get the videos directly. For those of you here, they will be up on the CBS website as soon as I can get them there. So if you missed any of them, you can find them there. And thank you once again for participating in this series.